Shame doesn't come from strangers screaming online. Shame comes from quiet voices in the past, the ones that knew you before the fairy tale was rehearsed, before the smiles were trained, before the narrative was weaponized. And today, that silence has cracked open, because long before palaces, protocols, and primetime interviews, there was a rejection that had nothing to do with royalty and everything to do with warning signs. For years, Prince Harry insisted the world misunderstood Meghan Markle. He framed every doubt as cruelty, every hesitation as bias. But now, a man from Meghan's life before crowns is explaining something far more dangerous than tabloid hatred. He's saying the first people to step back weren't the palace. They were a family. And families don't pull away for headlines. They pull away when they sense trouble. This isn't about bitterness. This isn't about jealousy. This isn't even about a breakup. This is about a door that quietly closed years before Harry ever opened his. Before Meghan became a global symbol, she lived in a smaller world. Ordinary homes, ordinary dinners, ordinary expectations. In that world was Joe Giuliano. And more importantly, there was Joe Giuliano's family. According to accounts now resurfacing, they didn't erupt. They didn't fight. They didn't accuse. They observed. And what they observed made them uneasy. Families notice patterns long before institutions label them. They notice how someone handles disagreement, how quickly warmth turns transactional, how ambition begins to eclipse intimacy. They watch who adapts and who demands others adapt to them. And when those patterns repeat, families don't stage confrontations, they slow things down. They create distance. They quietly refuse permanence. That's exactly where this story begins. According to Giuliano's account, the rejection didn't come from class anxiety or insecurity. It came from concern, a sense of emotional volatility followed by strategic detachment, intensity when alignment served a purpose, distance when it no longer did. This wasn't framed as malice. It was framed as hesitation. And in family dynamics, hesitation is often the final alarm before disengagement. At the time, Meghan reframed that distance as misunderstanding, ambition mislabeled, drive mistaken for coldness. Resistance became proof that she was meant for something bigger. That framing would later become familiar. But back then, there was no monarchy to blame, no tabloids to accuse, no ancient institution to cast as villain, just a family choosing not to proceed. Fast forward years later and enter Prince Harry. Harry didn't meet Meghan's past. He met a curated version of it, struggle without warning, reinvention without residue. Former relationships framed as chapters closed for sympathetic reasons, never patterns worth examining. And Harry, shaped by loss and armed with a savior instinct, believed every word. Protecting Meghan didn't feel optional to him. It felt like destiny. Inside royal circles, vetting doesn't stop at arsoms. It traces relationship arcs, family reactions, continuity. Advisors don't look for scandal, they look for repetition. And while Giuliano's family wasn't initially flagged as explosive, their absence mattered. A former partner whose family disengaged quietly. A marriage that followed later, ending abruptly, surgically, without emotional overlap. Alone, these details were nothing. Together, they whispered. Harry heard none of it. Instead, he interpreted every question as an attack, every pause as prejudice. He folded early family rejection into a broader persecution narrative. What had been caution became cruelty. What had been concern became bias. This was the first fracture between perception and pattern, and once that fracture forms, it spreads. Palace advisors didn't block the relationship. They watched. They noted gaps. They asked why Meghan's past showed exits instead of continuities, why families faded instead of integrated. These weren't accusations. They were preparations. But Harry, already defensive, experienced them as betrayal. This is where the emotional stakes explode. Harry had spent his life haunted by abandonment. Any hesitation now felt like history repeating itself. He doubled down emotionally. He stopped listening. He chose love over warning, not realizing institutions don't study the past to punish. They study it to predict. And patterns don't announce themselves loudly. They hide in departures. As the engagement approached, palace files quietly thickened. Not with scandal, but with absence. Former circles gone. Former families missing. A life segmented into clean breaks. Advisors noticed. Harry rejected the framing. He argued the past didn't matter. That love reset everything. But love doesn't erase repetition. It only delays recognition. Behind closed doors, concern hardened into unease. One faction urged accommodation, let responsibility stabilize behavior. Another pointed to Giuliano's family as the opening signal, and the later marriage as reinforcement. Advancement through alignment, followed by detachment once the next door opens. Harry heard character assassination. Meghan heard validation. And this is where the story locks blocks into place. Every severed relationship was reframed as proof of her strength. Every rejection became evidence that others couldn't keep up. Doubt was punished. Loyalty was rewarded. Harry responded exactly as expected by isolating himself further from voices urging caution. Years later, when these early warnings resurfaced publicly, they landed differently, because suddenly the palace wasn't the first to hesitate. It was the last. According to those close to Harry, the shift inside him was brutal and quiet. Anger didn't explode, it collapsed inward. Shame replaced defiance. Not shame toward Meghan, shame toward himself. The realization that warnings had existed long before titles, long before tabloids, long before global scrutiny, and that he had dismissed them all as enemies. That kind of realization doesn't produce confrontation. It produces silence. Harry withdrew. Conversations about the past became unbearable because acknowledging the pattern meant admitting the world hadn't misunderstood Meghan. He had, and once that truth appears, it can't be unseen. By the time the realization fully settled in, it was already too late to stop the momentum. Royal machines don't slam brakes, they recalibrate. And that recalibration began quietly, without press releases, without confrontation, without spectacle. Inside the palace, curiosity hardened into calculation. The question was no longer who was right. The question became how much damage can be contained. Institutions don't operate on emotion. They operate on probability. And probability, once patterns align, becomes difficult to ignore. What had once looked like isolated moments now formed a visible line. The Giuliano family's early hesitation. The absence of long-term integration. The first marriage that ended not with conflict, but with a clean emotional severance. Friendships that didn't carry forward. Circles that didn't overlap. Lives that appeared segmented rather than layered. None of it screamed scandal, all of it whispered strategy. This is how institutional alarm works, not with accusations, but with alignment. Inside Buckingham Palace, advisors stopped asking why and started planning for what next. They understood something Harry didn't want to accept yet. The issue was never whether Meghan belonged. The issue was continuity. And continuity, once broken repeatedly, doesn't repair itself through titles or vows. For Harry, the shift was devastating, but not in the way tabloids imagine. There were no screaming matches behind closed doors, no dramatic ultimatums. What replaced his earlier fury was something colder and heavier. Embarrassment without release, the kind that settles into the chest and refuses to move. Because the truth he was circling wasn't that others had failed Meghan, it was that he had misread the warning signs. He had spent years accusing institutions of cruelty, only to realize that the earliest hesitation hadn't come from power, privilege, or prejudice. It had come from ordinary people with nothing to gain. People who stepped back quietly because they sensed impermanence. That realization hollowed him. According to people familiar with Harry's inner circle, his behavior shifted subtly but unmistakably. He stopped arguing with advisors. He stopped demanding validation. He stopped trying to win the narrative. Instead, he withdrew. Conversations about the past became off limits, not because they were false, but because they were too accurate. This is where shame becomes corrosive. Acknowledging the pattern meant acknowledging that love hadn't protected him from repetition, that his instincts, shaped by grief, defensiveness, and a need to rescue, had led him away from clarity rather than toward it. That realization doesn't produce anger, it produces isolation. Meanwhile, Meghan interpreted the palace's recalibration very differently. Distance to her was confirmation. Another environment outgrown, another system resisting change, another chapter proving she was meant for something else. Where Harry felt doubt tightening, Meghan felt vindication expanding. This divergence quietly widened the gap. Harry wanted acknowledgement, some recognition that the warnings had been mishandled, that his loyalty had been justified. Meghan wanted autonomy, freedom from scrutiny, freedom from hesitation, freedom from systems that didn't immediately align with her vision. The palace wanted stability. These goals could not coexist. And so the institution did what it always does when alignment fails, it reduced exposure. Not out of spite, out of survival. Formalities remained, titles stayed, protocols held, but warmth receded. Support became conditional, access narrowed. This wasn't punishment, it was containment. From the outside, it looked like rejection. From the inside, it was acceptance of reality. For Harry, this felt like abandonment, but with a painful twist. Because the more the palace pulled back, the more the earlier warnings echoed. What he had once framed as cruelty now looked suspiciously like consistency. The Giuliano family hadn't rejected Meghan because she lacked worth. They had rejected permanence because they sensed impermanence. That distinction changed everything. By this point, the narrative Harry had defended publicly began collapsing privately. The persecution story no longer held when placed alongside non-royal rejections that predated fame entirely. The palace wasn't the origin of doubt. It was the last institution to catch up to it. This is where humiliation becomes internal, not public embarrassment, not scandal-driven shame, but the quiet humiliation of realizing that people who cared long before cameras and crowns had seen something he refused to see, that he had dismissed concern as cruelty, caution as bias, pattern as prejudice. And once that recognition lands, it doesn't leave. The palace, having reached its conclusions, stopped trying to convince Harry of anything. Institutions don't need agreement to function. They need predictability. And predictability by now was clear. The marriage would continue on its own terms. The crown would endure on its own terms. The two would no longer pretend to share a single future narrative. That's how royal stories end when they can't be resolved. Not with apologies, not with vindication, but with separation of record. Harry's shame didn't erupt into confrontation. It settled into silence. He avoided revisiting the past because doing so would mean admitting that love hadn't neutralized pattern, it had accelerated it. That defending against warning signs doesn't erase them, it only delays the cost. For the palace, the Giuliano family's early hesitation now looked less like coincidence and more like preface. They had no incentive to lie, no institution to protect, no narrative to sell. Their rejection existed quietly, years before fame complicated interpretation. That's why it mattered. Royal scandals often obsess over endings, departures, exits, resignations. But the truth almost always lives at the beginning, in the first doors that close quietly, in the warnings that arrive without accusation, in the moments dismissed because they don't match the story we want to believe. Harry didn't lose trust in institutions because they rejected Meghan. He lost trust in himself because he realized the warnings had been there all along, and he had chosen defiance over discernment. And once a pattern is named, it cannot be unseen. Not by families, not by institutions, and not even by princes. Not even by princes. Not even by princes. Not even by